The audiologist said the words slowly, like volume still mattered. "There's a window. Not much time." I nodded even though my ears were ringing, even though I was already struggling to hear the end of his sentence. On the drive home, I practiced how I would explain it. Not dramatically, just facts, numbers, a plan. My parents listened without interrupting. That part almost gave me hope. Then my dad said I should have been more careful. My mom said life wasn't fair. Later that night, my uncle knocked on my door. He smelled like gasoline and cold air. He didn't ask questions. He just handed me an envelope and told me to count it later. That envelope changed how I saw my family, and what I decided to stop doing for them. I didn't grow up expecting much from my parents, but I did expect concern. Even a pause. Something that said my hearing mattered more than being right. The diagnosis came after months of pretending the ringing would go away. I worked in a loud environment. I used cheap earbuds longer than I should have. I told myself I was young enough to bounce back. The doctor didn't scold me. He just explained what was happening and what it would cost to stop it from getting worse. $3,000. Not immediately life-changing money. Just urgent. When I told my parents, we were sitting at their kitchen table. Same table where bills had been spread out my whole childhood. My dad leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. My mom stared at her phone. "You should have taken better care of yourself," he said. She added without looking up, "We can't fix everything." They weren't struggling. They were comfortable. Vacations every year. New appliances when the old ones worked fine. But medical help, apparently, was where responsibility became a lecture. I left feeling embarrassed for even asking. That night, I got a text from my uncle. He asked if I was home. I said yes. He showed up 20 minutes later, parked crooked at the curb. He'd been sleeping in his car since his divorce. Odd jobs. No complaints. He handed me an envelope and told me to use it for my ears. Inside was cash. Wrinkled bills. More than I expected. I asked him where it came from. He shrugged and said he sold something he wasn't using anymore. Later, I found out it was the last tool set he owned. The thing he used to pick up work. I sat on my bed after he left and counted the money with shaking hands. That was the moment the confusion set in. Not gratitude. Confusion. Why was the person with the least giving the most? And why had the people with everything decided I wasn't worth helping? I didn't call my parents back. I didn't thank them for their honesty. I scheduled the procedure and went quiet. What I didn't know yet was how much silence would cost them later. I didn't tell my parents about the envelope, not because I was hiding it, but because it felt pointless. Their reaction had already told me everything I needed to know. Concern in our family was conditional. It showed up when it was convenient, when it didn't cost anything, when it didn't challenge the story they liked to tell about responsibility. I used my uncle's money for the procedure. I added what I could from savings. The clinic scheduled me quickly. The audiologist warned me recovery wouldn't be instant. Some loss would stay. Some sounds might never come back the same way. I nodded again, focused on getting through it. The day of the procedure, my parents didn't come. I didn't ask them to. I told them afterward, in a short message, that it had gone fine. My mom replied with a thumbs-up emoji. My dad didn't reply at all. Recovery was quiet in more ways than one. I spent evenings alone, avoiding noise, watching captions instead of listening. It gave me a lot of time to think. I started noticing patterns I'd ignored before. How often I'd been the one to help when something went wrong. How frequently my parents called when they needed advice, money moved around, paperwork explained. How rarely they asked how I was unless it led to something practical. I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I felt clear. A few weeks later, my dad called asking if I could help him figure out an issue with his insurance. I told him I wasn't up for phone calls and suggested he contact the provider directly. There was a pause on the line. "You used to handle this stuff," he said. "I can't right now," I replied. He sounded irritated, not concerned. Like I'd changed a routine without notice. After that, the requests didn't stop. They just shifted. Emails instead of calls. Messages phrased casually, as if they were favors, not expectations. I answered when I could. I didn't rush. I didn't over-explain. The difference was subtle but noticeable. My parents started filling the gaps themselves. Not well at first. Things were missed. Deadlines passed. Small fees stacked up. My uncle checked in on me regularly. He never asked for the money back. He never brought up what he'd sold. Sometimes he just sat with me while we watched TV quietly, the captions on, both of us pretending not to notice. One afternoon, my mom mentioned, almost offhandedly, that my uncle should really get his life together. She said it like concern, but it sounded like dismissal. That's when something settled fully in me. I realized the hierarchy in my family had never been about need. It was about comfort. Who was easy to dismiss. Who was expected to manage their own pain quietly. I didn't confront her. I didn't defend him. I just listened. Over time, I stopped offering help before it was asked for. I stopped anticipating problems. When my parents complained about stress, I sympathized without fixing anything. They noticed. My dad asked once if I was upset with them. I said no. That answer seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. I wasn't punishing them. I was adjusting. And adjustments have consequences. The first real consequence showed up quietly, the way most real ones do. My parents missed a deadline. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No emergency. Just a letter from an insurance company that they didn't fully understand, followed by a smaller letter explaining late fees and reduced coverage. My dad forwarded it to me with a short message. "Can you take a look?" Normally, I would have. This time, I didn't open the attachment right away. I read the message, locked my phone, and went back to what I was doing. Hours passed. Then a day. When I finally replied, I told him I wasn't feeling great and suggested he call the number on the letter. He didn't like that. He called instead. I didn't answer. That pattern repeated over the next few weeks. Small things slipping through. Bills paid late. Appointments missed. Confusion over forms they'd never bothered to learn because I was always there to translate. None of it was catastrophic. That was the point. They were inconvenienced, not ruined. And for the first time, the inconvenience was theirs. My mom started calling more often. Not asking for help directly. Just talking. Bringing up how stressful things had become. How hard it was to keep track of everything. She never mentioned my hearing. Never asked how recovery was going. One afternoon, she said something that stuck with me. "You're just so distant lately," she said. "I don't know what changed." I almost laughed. What had changed was that I stopped absorbing discomfort that wasn't mine. Around that time, my uncle ran out of money. He didn't tell me directly. I heard it from a cousin who mentioned he'd been parking behind a warehouse again, sleeping in his car, picking up whatever work he could find. I went to see him. We sat on the curb and shared takeout. I asked him why he'd sold his tools for me. He shrugged and said, "You needed them more than I did." That answer did something to me. Because my parents had needed nothing, and still chosen not to help. A week later, my dad called with a problem that actually mattered. A coverage issue that would cost them real money if it wasn't fixed quickly. He sounded tense. less annoyed, more uncertain. I listened carefully. Then I told him I didn't know how to fix it. There was a long pause. I could hear him breathing. "You always know how to fix this stuff," he said. "I don't anymore," I replied. And it was true. Not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't. That was the moment the dynamic cracked. Not shattered. Cracked. They stopped assuming. They started asking. Carefully. Like people unsure of their footing. And I realized something else too. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies. I didn't even want acknowledgement. I wanted distance that felt honest. And I was finally getting it. By the time my hearing stabilized, my relationship with my parents had already changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to and explain to someone else. It changed in tone, in pace, in what was no longer automatic. My follow-up appointment confirmed what the doctor had warned me about. Some damage was permanent. I would adapt. Hearing aids were discussed. Not urgently, but eventually. I thanked him and drove home in silence, letting the road noise blur into something manageable. I didn't tell my parents right away. When I finally did, weeks later, my mother said she was glad it hadn't been worse. My father said nothing. The conversation moved on quickly, like discomfort does when no one wants to sit with it. Around the same time, my parents started downsizing things they'd never had to think about before. Canceling services. Selling items they didn't really need. Adjusting plans. Nothing drastic. Just enough to notice. They asked for my input less. When they did, it came with hesitation. "If you have time," my mom would say. "No pressure," my dad added, like a disclaimer. I answered honestly. Sometimes yes. Sometimes no. They stopped calling my uncle entirely. That part bothered me more than anything else. He was still sleeping in his car some nights. Still refusing help unless it was offered carefully. When I told my parents he was struggling, my mom frowned and said, "He always makes bad choices." My dad nodded like that settled it. I didn't argue. Instead, I helped my uncle quietly. Not with grand gestures. With practical things. Gas cards. Groceries. A place to shower. When my hearing aid trial started months later, I gave him the first pair of noise-canceling headphones I'd bought and didn't need anymore. He laughed and said they made the world feel calmer. That's when it clicked. My parents had always framed responsibility as something you earned by being deserving. My uncle had never met their definition. Neither had I, when it mattered. The real consequence wasn't financial. It was exposure. Family members started noticing who showed up for whom, who listened, who didn't. Stories circulated quietly. Nothing dramatic. Just observations. My parents stopped being the default authority in conversations. People checked facts, asked questions. They felt it. One evening, my dad called and asked if we could talk. Just us. He sounded tired. He didn't apologize. He didn't mention the money. He said he hadn't realized how much I'd been handling over the years. He said maybe they'd leaned too hard on me. I listened. I thanked him for saying that. It was enough. Not because it fixed anything, but because I no longer needed more. I still speak to my parents. I still visit. But I don't manage their lives. I don't translate systems. I don't absorb their stress. And when they say something dismissive now, I don't correct it. I let it land where it belongs. My uncle eventually found steady work through someone I introduced him to. Nothing glamorous. Enough. He moved into a small room. The car stayed parked. Sometimes I think about that envelope. about how the person with the least gave without hesitation, and the people with the most offered advice instead. Losing some of my hearing changed how I listen, not just to sound, to people. And once you hear the difference, you don't unhear it. You just adjust who gets access, quietly, on purpose. And that finally feels like closure.